On President Donald Trump's first day in office, he said he planned to slap a 25% tariff on all Canadian and Mexican goods starting Saturday, February 1st. Many believe that's a threat or a negotiating ploy. But as the deadline approaches, time is running out for formal negotiations. So how would 25% taxes on trade affect us here in the North Country, where cross-border commerce and life is the norm? That's today's story of the day.
Support for Story of the Day comes from Morja Wealth Management, serving the North Country for 3 generations. MorjaWM.com, securities offered through Hightower Securities, LLC, member FINRA, SIPC. Hightower is an SEC-registered investment advisor. And Kinney Drugs, now offering specialized home medical equipment and supplies. Learn more at KinneyHomeCare.com.
Hey, I'm David Sommerstein. It's Tuesday, January 28th. First up, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik is taking a victory lap of the North Country this weekend as she prepares to become the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. The six-term Republican will hold 3 events across the 21st Congressional District Saturday. Stefanik will start her tour at 9 in the morning Saturday at the Quaker Spring Fire Department in Schuylerville in Saratoga County, where she lives with her husband and son. She'll also appear at the West Side Ballroom in Plattsburgh at 12:30 and the Grandview Restaurant in Ogdensburg at 4:30 in the afternoon. A vote for Stefanik's confirmation as ambassador is scheduled for Thursday in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. A final vote in the full Senate could happen soon after. The Adirondack Land Trust is hosting a free virtual event tonight about places where people with various disabilities can enjoy birdwatching in the Adirondacks. David Escobar has the details.
The Land Trust is partnering with Birdability, a national nonprofit dedicated to making birding more accessible for people with disabilities. Kat Fribley is its executive director.
Often when we say accessibility or access, we think immediately about mobility issues. The reality of birding is that it can and should be a gateway to nature for anyone.
Fribley and her team have been compiling a crowdsourced map of accessible birding locations across the country. That includes 5 locations across the North Country, places like the Sacandaga River Pathway and Silver Lake Bog Preserve in Ausable Forks. The registry provides photos of trails and details about things like trail surfacing and parking access. The idea is to give potential birders a sense of what they're signing up for before heading out to a trail. Fribley says part of Birdability's goal is to show potential birders just how accessible of an activity it can be.
I think sometimes when people hear birding, they have this sense of, someone dripping in cameras and scopes going out to check birds off lists. And certainly that's one way of birding. And what is really terrific is that there are as many ways of birding as there are people.
The Land Trust hopes to develop its own network of accessible wildlife trails at 2 of its newer properties in Lake Placid and Saranac Lake. And Fribley says accessible outdoor spaces aren't just for people with disabilities.
So really, when we're talking about building access, we're talking about something that ultimately is really about universal design and the ability for everyone to enjoy and be in community with each other and with the bird.
Fribley will talk more about the importance of accessible birding and share tips for removing birdwatching barriers at tonight's online event. It begins at 7 p.m. David Escobar, North Country Public Radio.
The Wall Street Journal reported yesterday that momentum is growing among President Donald Trump's advisors to slap tariffs on Canada before negotiations. That's what happened with Colombia over the weekend. So if tariffs against Canada take effect this weekend, what would that mean for the North Country? Amy Feiereisel asked around.
The American and Canadian economies are deeply and intricately tied together.
The United States and Canada are each other's largest trading partners for almost everything.
Dr. Gregory Gardner is a professor of economics at SUNY Potsdam. He says this isn't the first potential tariff war between the U.S. and Canada, but it is unusual. Historically, tariffs focus on specific industries, like dairy or timber. Trump's proposed blanket 25% tariff on all Canadian goods is something else.
The 25% is kind of a nuclear strike on trade, and we can expect a counterstrike.
Trump has said he's levying the tariffs because Canada isn't doing its part on border control and curbing the flow of migrants and illegal drugs. Outgoing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says less than 1% of both enter the U.S. from Canada. Other Canadian officials have promised to match American tariffs dollar for dollar. Gardner says that would mean all Americans would see higher prices as companies pass on costs to consumers.
Lots and lots of stuff that we buy from Canada, in some cases we don't even realize we're buying it from Canada, is going to become more expensive.
North Country residents would really feel the crunch, says Gary Douglas from the North Country Chamber of Commerce. That's because northern New York relies on Canada for a lot of its energy.
Well over $1 billion in hydroelectricity comes from Quebec into the grid in New York. Many of our dealers here in this area source their heating oil from the Port of Montreal, where it's refined and supplied.
We also get all our natural gas from up north. So for anyone not harvesting their own firewood, Douglas says tariffs would mean a huge spike in what it costs homeowners to stay warm in the North Country. He says tariffs would also be devastating for the hub of aerospace and transportation manufacturers located in Clinton County, which source a lot of material from Canada.
Components or parts, or in many cases, the actual raw materials that drive their whole operation. Again, that's why they're here in this region, is because of that proximity.
Douglas said 2 major Canadian companies with plants in Plattsburgh had planned big expansions of their U.S. operations this year. They've since told the Chamber of Commerce they're putting those expansions on hold because of the uncertain economic climate. Douglas says those are new North Country jobs that could cease to exist.
We estimate that 10 to 15% of the population in Clinton County got up this morning and went to work for a Canadian or border-related employer. Yeah, I think there's not an impact. There's an impact on everybody in every way if you were to see this trade war go forward on the terms that are being threatened at this point.
Of course, the big question is, will it? Will tariffs actually happen? Everyone I spoke with said they hope not, and that big threats were a central part of Donald Trump's negotiations playbook in his first term. Professor Gregory Gardner again.
This is just the way Donald Trump negotiates. He starts off threatening and trying to make you uncomfortable and frightened, and then starts gradually asking you for the things that he really wants.
Gary Douglas is hopeful that the tariffs are being used as a ploy, and that's all.
To give some credit to the administration, it's brutal, but it could be a very effective negotiating tactic in the end.
Now, whether or not the tariffs are actually levied or only go into effect for a short period, there could still be impacts in the North Country, particularly in tourism.
That's the big concern right now, is how much of this rhetoric leads to actual policy, but then what kind of an impression is left.
That's Corey Fram from the Thousand Islands International Tourism Council.
Generally speaking, Canadian citizens are not excited about what they're hearing. You worry about how that impacts somebody in their home and the decisions that they make with their dollars and what they want to do with their time.
He says while Canadians make up 10% of overall visitation to the American side of the Thousand Islands, they account for 25% of spending. He says the loss of Canadian visitors during COVID was severe, and anything that makes crossing the border more difficult hurts the marketability of the Thousand Islands.
And moreover, not even necessarily the economics, but the continued distancing of the two sides of the border and the culture, I think, is our biggest concern.
Fram says the way people move back and forth is part of local culture, for shopping, for sports, to see family. Up and down the border, that's what life is like, Americans and Canadians living side by side.
I think a lot of us are all kind of the same people, if you will, with the same backgrounds and, the same memories of the river.
Greg Paquin is mayor for the village of Messina, which shares a border crossing with Cornwall, Ontario, across the St. Lawrence River.
We have people from Cornwall that will come over for Thursday night, men's night at the Italian American Club. And, you look forward to seeing your friends from across the border.
He says he believes those relationships are strong and resilient, that they would survive trade disagreements. But he says regular Americans and Canadians would pay the real price of a trade war.
Canada has been by our sides for, many a decades, and you'd hate to lose an ally like that over tariffs. But again, people at higher pay grades than me make those decisions.
And those decisions will have to come soon if tariffs are to be avoided on February 1st. Over the weekend, Donald Trump said Canada wouldn't have to deal with tariffs if it became the 51st state of the U.S. Amy Feiereisel, North Country Public Radio.
We have more news all the time on our website, ncpr.org. Music today by Tim Elifritz of Johnsburg and Oscar Sarmiento of Potsdam. I'm David Sommerstein.